typically there's always an owner of each stage. An SDR might be the owner during the prospecting, and a new logo, there's an AE that owns it, and understanding what efforts they did put in. But equally important is, who are the people on our side? Were you talking to individual contributors? Were you talking to senior executives? Were you talking to people in the marketing department? Were you talking to people in the finance department, etc.? So once you have all of those pieces, all of a sudden, what was usually very opaque and hard to understand, now you can see the typical journey, and then you can start comparing.
Hi, friends. Welcome to the Sales Enablement Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Paul. That was Rob Kall. Rob is the CEO of Cien. And in our conversation, we talk about productivity in sales. In particular, how to measure true sales productivity, not activity, productivity. Now, this is one of my favorite topics to talk about in sales, and it's Rob's too. And well, the question is why? Well, because most sales leaders operate with a fundamental misunderstanding of what productivity means in sales. They really don't get it, but they should, because without this understanding, sales leaders continue to be in the dark about how to fundamentally improve sales performance, how to forecast growth, and, well, much, much more. So Rob shares with us the additions that they've made to Cien, their product, to measure this true sales productivity, and how Cien's customers are using the data to make better decisions. So we get into all this and much, much more, but before we get to Rob, I want to remind you to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to it. And if you subscribe, we'd certainly appreciate it if you could leave us a review and give us some feedback about how we're doing. So thank you very much. All right, let's jump into it. Rob, welcome back to the show.
Great to be here, Andy. I enjoyed it last time, and I'm sure we're going to have an even better conversation today.
I suspect we will. So tell people a little bit about Cien, and you're still based in Barcelona?
I'm between Miami and Barcelona.
Miami and Barcelona, okay.
Of course, right now, just getting across the pond is not so easy. So
no.
Yes, I used to travel every 3 weeks. Now it's more like whenever there is not a travel restriction. So.
But home is Barcelona.
Home is, where the kids are, where the, where the wife is, and so forth, and it varies a little bit. So I've been living most of my life in Miami, but for the last few years, I've been doing a lot of R&D here in Barcelona.
Got it. Okay. Very interesting. And you have a new baby daughter as well.
Yes, I do.
So you getting any sleep?
I don't know if I want to jinx it by saying that this is unlike every other baby. She's actually already at 3 months sleeping, only waking up once a night, and that never happened. I have 4 children prior to that, so that's, I don't know, if we're just getting better at it as time goes on.
Yeah, I thought so too. First child slept through the night very early. And we thought, we know exactly what to do. Yeah. They come out differently, and they've got their own personalities.
It can change at any time, and I'm hoping that me mentioning it now on this show does not change anything. But
well, hopefully she keeps sleeping through. So, all right. So, folks who didn't hear previous conversation or don't know about Cien, tell us about what you guys do, and give us a little bit of your background.
Sure. On a very high level, we make sense of sales data, specifically in the CRM, trying to use that data to understand why your reps are not making quota, why your leads are not as good as they should be, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason I came from it, I unlike you, I don't have that classical VP of sales background. I've always been a technology entrepreneur, but in our last company, we had a lot of success, and that was great. And as a consequence, we scaled our sales team very rapidly. And we went from 2 to 100 reps in a period of 3 years.
Okay.
And
wow.
in my math brain, being a...
And what type of product was that?
Sorry?
What type of product was that?
It was a SaaS product in the short-term rental space, so it's doing everything related to back office accounting, payment processing, and it was also connecting to all the portals. We had partnerships with Airbnb, TripAdvisor,
Got it.
Booking.com, and so forth. So it was essentially the hub of an operation for a property manager. And again, as we were growing that team, I was constantly saying, why is it that we can't get the teams to quota faster? Why is it that so many reps are kind of churning out and never really make it, and so forth? And it was always the same type of answers from the VP of sales and the line managers. Oh, this person doesn't quite know the product yet. Or this person is not putting enough effort into her work. Or this person, they're just talking, they're never closing. These kind of non-quantitative statements that they made about reps. And I said, well, I want to help those reps get better. And if I can measure this stuff, and if we can help them identify their weak areas, maybe we can bring them up to quota and to do well. And if we can't do that, at least we know why they were not successful, and we can do better next time we hire someone. And that was essentially the impetus. And I thought this was going to be easy, as you always think when you start a company.
Right.
Because I worked a lot with CRM data in the past, and in our past products, we had CRM functionality built in. So I kind of felt like I knew it inside and out. And boy, were we up for a surprise when we got, the first and the second and the third and the 20th and the 40th CRM data set from our clients, right? Everybody has data problems in their CRM. And I think that's something that we probably should talk a little bit about today, because it's something that I hear from pretty much every single revenue leader. I love to do X, Y, Z, but I don't trust my data. I'm having a hard time making sense out of my reports. Everybody's backlogged because we can't get this stuff right, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, what data are they most frustrated with?
That's a great question. And that's exactly the question that I asked revenue leaders, and the answer is always vague. It's just bad, And I said, well, so I mean, we can start there, because we can start untangling how data can be bad in a go-to-market database like a CRM instance, for example. Mm-hmm. And I think the first thing you kind of want to separate is like the data that the rep needs to do their work, and the data you need as a revenue leader or as an analyst to kind of understand what's going on, right? So the stuff that the reps need, sure, no reps likes to see duplicates and so forth, but in the end, what I found is that they just continue working, and if a particular person is outdated, their contact title says that they're there, but like they're no longer there, or they figure it out. And of course, many companies today invest in, Zoom Info or Lead IQ or some tool like that to just look up a new contact if you can't get that. So that's friction for the reps, but they usually overcome it. And everybody has the expectation that information is not always 100% accurate. The thing that I find people being more frustrated with is when they can't trust their numbers. And why is it that they have spent so much time building dashboards? They spend so much time investing in all of these RevUp stacks in terms of tools to do predictions and so forth, right? Mm-hmm. And why is it that the data is still bad? And that's
before we move on though, let's dig into that. So you say So be specific. What numbers don't revenue leaders trust?
What numbers do revenue leaders trust? Most of the time, they can trust the big number, the amount one, right?
Sure.
But beyond that, because that ties into commission statements and into the billing systems and so forth. The rest is oftentimes very much up to debate. And the reason for it is not a single thing, but multiple smaller problems. We can kind of dig into each one of them a little bit and explain how they're causing problems, what you can do about it, and get a little bit more specific on it if you like.
Yeah, no, I think that'd be useful because I think that yeah, I mean, this is one of the issues everywhere is, numbers are bad. The leads are bad. Everything's just bad. It's like, oh,
right.
How is it bad? Tell me, be specific. How is it bad? What's the number that you don't like, that you don't trust? So let's dig into a couple because I think that's really important.
Yeah. So again, we look at quality across 6 dimensions. I'm going to rattle them off here, and we're going to dig into them. But basically, when we're trying to analyze data, we want to understand, is there duplication? So that's pretty easy for everybody to understand. Number 2, is there completeness of records? In other words, do records have the fields that you are using to analyze? Like, for example, do records have lead source? If you're trying to understand lead source. Number 3, consistency. Do you have data that is classified and organized in a consistent way? And the answer is almost always no. Number 4, and this one gets tricky, and we can talk a little bit about that, sales process. Can you really understand where a record is in terms of the sales journey and the process that the reps have used? So we'll probably have a little time to talk about that. And then number 5, when you're looking at activity patterns, are you capturing what reps are doing, or is most of the data missing? And then the last one, if you're using any type of AI, can you trust the AI that you're using to actually give you good results? And when I break it down like that, we have a little slide that we show to people and so forth. They're like all of them, right? And they say, I have problems on all of those categories.
Sure.
And then you start saying, okay, here's how you can actually get ahead. Because everybody kind of comes to this thing, yeah, we really should do an overhaul. We really should start from scratch. We should really clean up our data. And some companies do start those processes to kind of, quote unquote, fix it at the source. But they tend to be forever projects, and they never tend to finish. And they attack one of those dimensions, let's say duplication, and they leave the other 5 bad, or like, and what have you gained? And that's what I'm seeing. Yeah, we have run this project now. Our IT team has been working with this one. These are the types of things I hear over time. So what I want to kind of help people understand is that in some cases, the source data will remain bad until you do something very drastic, and that can take a lot of time and cost a lot of money. But you can still go in and fix your reports and fix your data in the meantime to get some trust in your numbers.
Well, but so I just want to close that gap, because you're talking about trust in your numbers, but all the attributes you talked about are sort of static data, quote unquote, relatively static data. You're talking about, contact information and so on. None of the 6 factors you really talked to were quantitative. Well,
they are. Let's start with example number 1, consistency. Sure. Right? You are getting the most common complaint from your reps. The leads are bad, right?
Yeah, right.
So you're like, okay, well, let me see what leads are good and what leads are bad. And you have this inclination that some of the lead sources that you're using, you're taking data from 3 different lists, and you have some inbound lead generation programs that are going on. You have the inclination that some of those are bad. So the first thing you do is like, let me see if I can group and just do a conversion check and see what percentage are converting on each one of those lead sources. And what you find typically, going back to your comment about static versus dynamic data, is that data, which should be static and should be set in stone, has changed over the last, 3 years. So like instead of having 20 clean lead sources, and this I see all the time, 200 individual lead sources that are not useful in doing any type of analysis. It might say something like Dreamforce 2019, Dreamforce 2018, okay? And then one has a super high conversion and the other one doesn't, because it's like small numbers and it's not statistically relevant. So what you want to start doing is to make those consistent. Dreamforce is obviously a trade show event. Make sure that all trade show events are grouped together. make sure that all online marketing campaigns are grouped together, etc. So all of a sudden you can see what's the difference between my online marketing campaigns that are generating leads that way versus my trade show versus probably what almost every single marketing department does, which is to do list augmentation, right? And pushing in. So when you get a clean list, all of a sudden you get statistically meaningful results, and it's much easier to see the patterns that you probably missed before, and you can then right. So that's just one example. So is that static or dynamic? Well, it changes all the time, and
it's both. Yeah,
and you can do some of that cleanup one time, and you have the data that is more useful, right? And then if you save that, you can pull it out again next quarter and do a little bit better. But that's consistency, and that goes across all of the different dimensions. It goes across geographical dimensions. It goes across classifying the size of the companies versus the industries of the companies and so forth. And we always see problems in all of those things. But let's move to another example, which is duplication. So how does duplication make this analysis example that I just talked about difficult? Well, the most obvious one is, like, for example, you're trying to you have 3 different instances of the Microsoft account in there, and one rep worked on one of them, and another rep worked on another one, and so forth, right? Right. That's bad. What we are seeing is that that's usually not a huge issue, though. It might be like 3% of the records are duplicated in that manner. But if you're trying to do analysis, there's also other things that are coming into play, and that is the fact that almost all organizations today use both leads and accounts in some way that leadership has defined as this is our ABM plus, or like they come up with some fancy name to call this stuff, where they are doing this. Or we were feeding in leads from our web forms, but we're also setting up an account base. So you're going to, and the end result is essentially that now, in some cases, you have just accounts. In some cases, you have just leads. And in many, many cases, you have 5 leads for the same accounts. And what happens when you have all of that stuff and it's not is disorganized like that is that you're trying to do analysis and look for example, what's the conversion rate into opportunities, right? Your denominator and denominators are all screwed up. And you can get I have an example right now when I'm showing people where it's like a 10x off. It seems like if you just run it on the leads table, that they have a conversion rate of less than 1%. Terrible. Like only 1. But when you consolidate all of the duplicate leads and all that stuff, it's actually 10%. So it's not a little bit off. It is way off.
Yeah, 10x, right.
And again, these are the things that not addressing this stuff and trying to do it again as a big IT project and affecting everybody's workflow and so forth has a lot of risks. So there are ways you can kind of go in and just do a quick cleanup on the data and get those results separate from everything else and start understanding what's going on. So that was duplication. So it seems like an easy problem, but as we just covered, it can go into 5 different dimensions because of the way the companies are organizing their Salesforce data and so forth. So,
well, okay. So I'll say I had a question I'll save till later. But so in Cien, so how are you guys helping customers with that problem?
So you and me to some degree are sales professionals, revenue professionals. So we can open up a spreadsheet and see these patterns, and we can kind of search using fuzzy search and matches and so forth to kind of clean this stuff up. It requires domain knowledge, and it requires analytical knowledge, and it requires more than anything else time, right? So what we are working on is to automate all of that stuff using artificial intelligence. So that because the same knowledge that exists in our heads can be put into the AI, and the same type of fuzzy searches, understanding that Andy and Andrew are probably, the same person, right? If they have the same last name and work for the same company. Then that's something that you and I can understand, but an AI can understand that today as well, right? And that way you can start getting that clean data much easier and with much less effort.
Got it. I like it. So one of the things that you and I have talked about in the past is this issue of data to help revenue leaders and sales leaders measure true productivity for sellers.
Yeah.
And to me, this is sort of like a holy grail type thing, because I think for the most part, sales leaders are sort of shooting in the dark because they don't really understand, because they equate productivity with activity as opposed to output, which is what productivity is about. So sounds like you sort of been working on something that sort of helps provide some visibility into that within your product.
Yeah, so, absolutely.
Yeah, tell us a bit about that.
Well, so we have already covered a couple of the problems related to this stuff, the duplications and so forth. Another piece that revenue leaders are always trying to kind of figure out is, what is my sales process? Like, when do I start prospecting? When do I end prospecting and start what I call the first new logo sale? Mm-hmm. I'm successful with that. What happens after that? There is, some account manager perhaps that are taking over, and that person is supposed to see if he can get a renewal or an expansion sale and so forth. And the way they're doing this stuff is that they are coming up with super complicated schemes. And usually it involves adding 15 additional custom fields into Salesforce, various elaborate handoffs, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And the end result is always that all of these custom fields are haphazardly filled out. People still need to do certain things to get the deals done. Like the AE is supposed to, hand it off to the AM, but in this particular case, AE knows that if she does it right now, it's going to fall through and it's not going to be done right. So she continues to work on it, et cetera, right?
Right.
These are the realities. So we felt like, and you're trying to get that out of the standard data that you have in Salesforce in terms of the accounts and the opportunities and so forth. Oftentimes it is next to impossible to make sense out of it. So What we said is, for every single account that you're going, it's a journey. And it starts with the lead being generated. Then at some point, hopefully a rep starts reaching out to it. If the lead was generated for a web form, the rep should touch it, 5 minutes later. Mm-hmm. If it was added by a marketing department as a target account, it doesn't matter if they do it this week or next week or maybe even next quarter, right? Because it's not like that customer is sitting there holding their breath for the first, hey, how you doing? I'm selling Acme products, right? Mm-hmm. But there's that step. Then you have prospecting, and that is all about, making a basic qualification on both sides. Does the buyer have any need or related to the services? Does can the seller see that there is some type of way to make a deal happen?
Right. So they become a sales qualified opportunity.
Right. Once that happen, you create an opportunity. Now it's a new logo. And then it goes into the rest of the stuff, and hopefully that cycle goes on with upselling opportunities over and over again forever. And it's a very lucrative account. That's how the vast majority of sales organizations are operating today. But they can't get the journey of those things. They can never tell in an easy way how long does it take to go from stage 1 to 2 in average. What's the average, win rate of those things? Because there's always data that is confounding these measurements, right?
Oh yeah, look at the differences in definition of win rate.
Exactly. That's something we've talked about before, right? And again, what we wanted to do was to create that single sales record that outlines the entire journey, see who were involved on the seller side. So typically there's always an owner of each stage. An SDR might be the owner during the prospecting, and a new logo, there's an AE that owns it, and so forth. Mm-hmm. And then understanding, what efforts they did put in. But equally important is, who are the people on the other side? Were you talking to, individual contributor? Were you talking to senior executives? Were you talking to people in the marketing department? Were you talking to people in the finance department, etc.? So once you have all of those pieces, all of a sudden, what was usually very opaque and hard to understand, now you can see the journey, the typical journey, and then you can start comparing. What are journeys that are successful versus what are journeys that are not successful? And that comes into things like that I know a lot of people are talking about, like, we got to be better at account planning and account discovery and so forth. The difference is that you go from, anecdotal, it is always better for us to do this versus that, to quantitative. Here's right. what really works. And in many cases, it might be, counterintuitive. For example, we found for one company that the less they talked to the IT department, the more they won the deals. Whereas they thought that they needed to get the buy-in from the IT department, and instead it was the opposite. They just opened up a lot of questions and doubt, and it prolonged the thing. And if they could make the case to the department that was actually using the product, they made the case to the IT department themselves, and they won the deal faster. Mm-hmm. So it is essentially to be able to understand the entire journey, what steps, how long, and then coming back to what you were talking about, the productivity of each one. Because once you have all of that stuff, you can then see how much effort did the rep spend on a new logo deal. And it comes to take it one step back. Mm-hmm. When I go in and look at the revenue operations report and so forth, a lot of times I just see pipeline. Okay, right now we have $100 million in pipeline. The first question I always ask is, well, how much of that is new logo versus expansion versus renewals and so forth? Mm-hmm. And the answer is usually, well, we can't really tell. It's hard, but we're supposed to code it, but it's the coding has been done incorrectly, and some of it is like, so then. I say, well, the value of that pipeline varies enormously depending on what the type of items you have in it, because they're not closing at the same rate, right? Mm-hmm. So being able to track that entire journey, that has been a big effort, and it allows us essentially to get insights into productivity, best practices, what does not work, and then also to really let reps or to let revenue leaders understand what steps are in most need for optimization. Right. And it's different in every company.
Well, some of the metrics that you're tracking in this, you talk about measuring value created, and I was really sort of curious about that. So how do you measure something like value?
Right, that's a great question. So the way we're doing that is by looking at, if you have all of these steps, you understand that a little bit of value is created in each one of those steps. If you sold for $100 million in a year, $100 million worth of value was created, right? But it was not all done by the AE. It was not all done by the lead generation team. It was not all done by the prospecting team. There was some contribution from each one of those groups. And if the lead gen team creates really great leads, their contribution is obviously much higher. Great leads meaning,
how do you quantify that?
Right.
Among
so
the various steps, right?
That goes into this. So that's another great question, and it goes into our AI aspects of this. Because the only time AI becomes useful is if you can trust it, you can understand what it's doing, and that it somehow has transparency around whether it's good or not. Because just saying that that's AI and we can predict X, Y, Z, that's not very useful. The way we're doing that is by looking at each one of those steps we just talked about in that single sales process journey and predicting in advance how likely are we going to be successful. So before the rep has started, let's make a prediction and see, given these things. So we know that certain industries are better than other ones. We know that certain segments of the markets are better than other ones. We know that certain lead sources are better than others. So we can also know that if an SDR has done certain things, the opportunity is better qualified than otherwise. All of those things are essentially metrics that can now be used. So all of a sudden,
so just to pause there. So what you're saying is that you're making a prediction based with your algorithm based on the SDR using the right lead sources in the right industry and so on,
and taking the right steps. You know, like a lead that has only had a 5-minute meeting before it gets handed over to the AE is much more likely to say, who are you from? I mean, this is a very common thing, right? That an SDR team is creating opportunities but haven't done the proper qualification. So when the AE goes to the meeting, the person that's there saying, I don't know, or there are no-shows or what the common problems are happening, right? So there are telltale signs in that scenario. Maybe there was only one short meeting. Maybe there were not a lot of engagement in emails that happened after that. If you know those things, you can then assign a new probability that is much lower. And that basically, going back to your question around value, if you're delivering a lot of low probability leads, obviously that's much lower value than if you create a lot of high probability leads. And what we're doing is essentially just taking the $100 million we talked about before and slicing it up so that it goes into the right bucket and it balances it then. And again, you can always argue about, you should give a little bit more value to this, a little bit more less value, but you can't argue about it if you're doing it consistently across all of the different leads, right? So all of a sudden you can understand where value is being created and where value is being lost, because it can be the opposite problem. And this happens, we see it all the time in companies also, where you give reps high quality leads that they are ready to go on, and then because they have maybe too many leads, or because they have different priorities, or they don't have a way to understand that those are actually high-quality leads, they ignore them, or sit on them too long, or abandon them after a single try, and so forth. And there, you want to basically identify that opposite problem, that there was not enough follow-through. And with this approach, all of these things that used to be opaque, and everybody kind of goes in and does spot checks on it and get a feel for it. But it was never possible to do, at least we couldn't figure out how to do it without going after this type of technology, to know it at scale and know it for your entire team and know it how it has changed over time. Because that's really what you want to understand, right? Here's where we are suffering right now. We have an SDR team that we brought on. They are not qualifying the leads. The quality of those opportunities that they are passing over are much lower than the opportunities the A's are creating themselves. Just the difference between two probabilities.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is what you're doing is you're saying is, look, okay, for a certain revenue number, we are allocating contribution percentages by function, basically.
Yeah. To
say, okay, if we have $100 million in revenue, that $100 million, we contribute so much of the value created, let's say, as you said, the revenue to sales development, some to AE, some to CS, and so on.
Exactly. And we're doing it not just on the function, but we're doing it down to the individual record.
Right, but I'm just saying, starting at the function level, but then you do it down to the individual person, right?
Exactly. And when you can do that, you can settle a lot of the dilemmas that are happening in sales organizations. You can settle is the lead distribution fair? Because today, fairness is everything, right? You never want to be in an organization that is considered unfair, that is not giving reps of similar category a similar shot at doing well. So you can solve for that problem, for example. You can also solve for problems around productivity that we talked about before. Because if you know how much value was created, and then you know how much time you saved, you have that simple formula, value divided by times. So all of a sudden you can see whether there's a rep that is generating a lot more value than their peers. What are they doing differently? And again, sometimes those results are very counterintuitive. They may not be following the process that the sales leaders have set up, that the best practice have been. They may take in shortcuts, but those shortcuts still work. And if you are aware of that stuff, you can coach towards success as opposed to coach towards process.
Yeah. Well, I can guarantee that the top performers are not following the rules specifically. Yeah. Right. And process tends to be lowest common denominator oftentimes, unfortunately.
Oh, again, process is important, but only if it adds value. And if it is the opposite, then if you can find where it actually adds friction, you might be able to make small changes that can make a big impact.
So how do you account for in your model how do you account for somebody's working on an account, the AE leading the charge, but there are lots of other resources within the company that are brought to bear to help close the deal.
Right. Yeah.
So how are you accounting for that in the value creation model or the contribution to value model that you have?
Right. So great question. So like everything, every model is a simplification of reality. And every model is wrong, but some models are very useful. So, for example, when it comes to a manager that comes into a single call and helps maybe close it, the helicopter manager that feels like he or she should be present in that critical call to provide support for them. We know that they were there. Because we can track their activities along with everything else. We don't allocate the value to that manager separately. It becomes very, very granular. We give the value to the AE. But we can then see how much attention did the manager put on each one of those reps, and you can essentially then go back and say, hey, there are some reps here that the manager feels needs a lot of support, and there are some that are not. And that way you can understand whether there is an issue in terms of coaching and training and so forth, right?
Yeah, I was looking more from the perspective of saying, look, a complex deal. Been my experience is, two sellers might achieve somewhat the same result, but one required a lot more sales engineering support, a lot more management support, a lot more engineering support or whatever than the other. So on the surface, it looks like, they both hit their number.
Right.
But the cost of one hitting the number was substantially higher than the one that perhaps was a bit more self-sufficient, let's say.
Right. So we track all of those things because as a manager comes in, their activities get associated with the same step in the sales process that we were just tracking, and we can see what meetings they participated in and so forth. And we can then include that in the total hours spent on that. We call that the duration, which is another topic we can talk a lot about. How do you know how much time a rep spends on things? And obviously today there are a lot of tools out there. You're affiliated one that is tracking phone calls and emails and so forth. What makes this stuff possible and more kind of less science fiction is that today we're no longer, most of the time, that's not all the time, but most of the time relying on the reps entering in every single activity manually that they're doing as part of their sales rep.
Sure.
That said, we all know that there is still a lot of data that is not getting into the sales force instance of things that are happening in the sales process. And that goes into kind of like the last thing that I talked about in the beginning of the conversation, that you want to know how much of the data you're missing. And I don't know how much time we have, but like I have a pet peeve with people counting cases when it comes to COVID. Because cases in COVID is not how many people were infected. It's how many people reported that they were infected, right? And if 10 people reported that they're infected, maybe there were 20 people that actually were infected because they had mild symptoms and so forth. The same thing happens.
They didn't test, right?
Right, and the same thing happens in CRM. Like the one quick text that you had with the buyer to route something, that text never made it into this to the Salesforce instance because you were doing it from your personal phone or whatever, right?
Right.
And being able to understand how much of the data you're missing is very useful in both of those cases. In COVID, because you want to understand if the wave has peaked or not, or if you're just missing a lot, and people are today obviously looking at things like positivity rates to do that. And in terms of understanding the sales process and what effort goes into that, you can assume that there are some data and some reps are obviously worse at collecting this information or entering in this information. So you can essentially give you can give a score to each person. How much of this person's data do I think I have? And when you have that, all of a sudden doing these types of time management analysis becomes much more accurate and interesting.
That's interesting to think about.
So these are the types of problems that we are spending a lot of time doing. And the reason for it is obviously because we wanted to be able to understand a sales team. We want to go into Revenue Leader, and we work a lot with management consulting companies that are doing this stuff. And in the past, they did this stuff by going around the sales floors and observing and doing surveys and talking to revenue leaders. And those are all useful things, but they are much harder to do today when people are not traveling as much, and they are also subject to bias and false information. So what we want to do is to get that same type of insight through data.
Yeah, interesting. No, I like it. I like the approach. All right, well, Rob, unfortunately, we've run out of time. Tell folks how they can connect with you and learn more about Cien.
Sure. You can always find me on LinkedIn, Robert Kall, Kall. And on Twitter, same handle. And website is cien.ai, CIEN.ai.
Got it. Well, Rob, thanks for coming by. Hopefully we didn't jinx Ruby and all continues smoothly apace. And we'll look forward to talking again shortly.
Yeah, I agree. Likewise. I like our geek sales ops conversations. Hopefully, some other people are equally into these topics as we are.
We hope so as well. So, all right, Rob, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, friends, that's it for this episode. First of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen. As always, I'm so grateful for your support of this show. And I want to thank my guest, Rob Kall, for sharing his insights with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast, Sales Enablement with Andy Paul, on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. So thank you for your help with that. And as always, thank you so much for investing your time with me today. Until next time, I'm your host, Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone.